What's up, Man Fans? I'm your host, Josh Black, and this is the Man Fans Fantasy Football Podcast. Hit me up on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF and on Facebook at ManFansFootball. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's where you can check out our brand new video series, Draftkings Fantasy Locks. It's a short video designed to help you guys get started building your lineups, and I'll put a link to the channel in the description box below. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers over there on the YouTube, so hook me up. Go to our channel, subscribe, and click that notification bell. NFL Week 7 is here, and Man fans know what time it is. It's time to get down to business with that Week 7 DraftKings Fantasy Preview. As always, I'm going to give you my top plays for Sunday's main slate. We'll break down every position using DraftKings pricing, Pro Football Focus statistics, and betting lines by Bovada. Let's start under center. The last few days have been crazy. Friday's injury report opened up a ton of fantasy value. And we've got another schedule change. The Bucs-Raiders game got bumped down to 4:05, and the Seahawks-Cardinals game got moved back to Sunday Night Football. Now both games are included on DraftKings main slate, so we've got some work to do. When it comes to quarterbacks, there's value all across the board. I'm going to break down this position by tiers and give you at least one play in every range. So let's start above 7K. Arizona Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray. At home against Seattle, Arizona's a 3-point underdog. He's priced at $7,100 on DraftKings and projected for 21.6 fantasy points. Murray rolls into Week 7 as QB2 in fantasy scoring. Dude's exceeded 3 times cost per point in every game this season. Last time out against Dallas, Kyler got off to a slow start and ended up with only 9 completions for the entire game. But he threw for 188 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no picks. And he rushed for 74 more, plus another score. This week, Kyler faces off against the Seattle defense that surrenders the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. The Seahawks allow an average of 376 yards per game passing. That's the most in the league. And last time out, they got ran over by the Vikings. And that bodes well for Murray's already sky-high rushing floor. Dude leads all quarterbacks with 370 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. Earlier, I mentioned Kyler's QB2 in fantasy scoring. But what I didn't tell you is that he's only thrown for 300 plus passing yards one time this season. And I like him to do it again this week. Here's a bold prediction. I think Murray hits both bonuses in Week 7. 300 plus through the air, 100 plus on the ground, and a 2 touchdown minimum. If you're playing cash games, you're playing Kyler Murray. In the 6K range, I'm targeting Detroit Lions quarterback Matt Stafford. The Lions are at the Falcons, and Detroit's a 2.5-point dog. Stafford's priced at $6,500 on DraftKings, and Pro Football Focus has him projected for 19.8 fantasy points. Stafford disappointed fantasy owners last week. The Lions got out to an early lead and had a ton of success running the football, and I don't see that happening again this week. Stafford draws an Atlanta defense that ranks 27th against opposing quarterbacks. They allow 8.6 yards per attempt and 344 yards per game passing. The Falcons have really struggled in terms of sacks and interceptions. This secondary's gotten burnt all season. Last week, Kirk Cousins lit them up in the second half, finishing the game with 343 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 picks, and a pair of 2-point conversions. And surprisingly enough, the Falcons were tough against the run last week. They played fast and held Alexander Mattison in check. So I don't see Detroit running like they did against the Jags. This game, it's got serious shootout potential, and Matt Stafford's in a nice spot. Not only do the Falcons give up a ton of passing yards, they've allowed 18 passing touchdowns. That's the worst in the league. Conversely, Stafford's near the top of the league in terms of end zone throws and end zone touchdown percentage. I like him for around 300 passing yards, and I think 3 touchdowns is well within the realm of possibility. You can fire up Matt Stafford this week. If you want to go value city shopping, I got 3 guys for you. Cincinnati Bengals Joe Burrow, at home against Cleveland, priced at $5,500, projected for 19.2 fantasy points, and this is a prime spot against a piss-poor Cleveland secondary. Plus, Joe Mixon's out, and that means more pass attempts for Joe Burrow. Washington quarterback Kyle Allen at home against Dallas, priced at $5,200, projected for 16.3 fantasy points, and I'm a lot higher on Allen than most. and you'll see why this week. Dallas is the fantasy cheat code for quarterbacks, and I like Kyle Allen to smash that projection. And the last guy I want to touch on is New York Jets' Sam Darnold. At home against Buffalo, he's priced at $5,000, projected for 16.2 fantasy points, and this play comes with some risk. This is Darnold's first game back from a shoulder injury, but the game script and the juicy matchup put him in play for me this week. Moving on, let's dive into my top running back plays for Week 7. The running back landscape has dramatically changed in the last 48 hours. I plan on paying up at the position, and I still might, but there's a ton of value under $5K, and it's going to be hard to ignore. If you're paying up at running back, your best bet is New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara. He's at home against Carolina, and New Orleans is a 7.5 point favorite. Kamara's priced at $7,900, and Pro Football Focus has got him projected for 24.5 fantasy points. The last time we saw Kamara was Week 5. The Saints were in comeback mode the entire second half, and Kamara saw his rushing volume take a hit. But he commanded 10 targets in the passing game, and he came through with 20 fantasy points. This week, the matchup is super juicy. The Panthers rank 31st against opposing running backs. They allow 4.9 yards per carry, 121 rushing yards per game, and 9 rushing touchdowns. Over the last 2 weeks, they've given up 11 catches to opposing running backs, and that's got me taking a long look at Alvin Kamara. Dude's a beast in the passing game. He leads all running backs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Plus, the Saints will be without wide receivers Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders for this game, so expect Kamara to be heavily involved. Backup running back Latavius Murray's always a threat to vulture a touchdown, but I think Alvin hits value on catches and yardage alone. I like Kamara for 150 scrimmage yards, 6+ catches, and a touchdown. You can lock him in. Green Bay Packers running back Aaron Jones. Green Bay's at Houston and a 3-point favorite. DK's got him priced at $7,200, and Pro Football Focus has him projected for 16.1 fantasy points. A little caveat before the breakdown. Jones popped up on Friday's injury report with a calf strain, and he's questionable for this game. But it's a 1 o'clock kickoff, and if he's active, I'm not worried. The Packers' lead back comes into the week as RB4 in fantasy scoring. Jones is a top 10 running back in terms of rushing and receiving yards. Not to mention, he scored 7 touchdowns. Last week, he underwhelmed with 13 fantasy points, but that's to be expected against Tampa Bay. They're the best run D in the league. This week, it's the polar opposite. Jones draws a Houston defense that ranks 27th against opposing running backs. They allow 5.4 yards per carry and 177 yards per game rushing. That's the worst in the league. Derrick Henry exposed the Texans last week. 212 yards rushing, 52 yards receiving, and a pair of touchdowns. So I like Jones to pick up where he left off. And that's good news for the Packers, because their offense looked out of sync last week. Aaron Rodgers was under a ton of pressure, and Green Bay got blown out. I expect the Packers to come out and run the football, so giddy up Aaron Jones. Let's call it 100+ rushing yards, 3 or 4 catches, and a touchdown. Just make sure you got Jamal Williams on standby. Cleveland Browns running back Kareem Hunt. Cleveland's at Cincinnati and a 3-point favorite. DK's got him priced at $6,800, and he's projected for 18 fantasy points. Hunt came up short last week. Pittsburgh jumped out to a huge lead, and Cleveland's rushing attack went by the wayside. But without Nick Chubb, Kareem's been the guy. He's handled 67% of Cleveland's rushing attempts, and he's in a nice spot this week. Hunt draws a fantastic matchup against Cincinnati. The Bengals rank 14th against opposing running backs. They allow 5.1 yards per carry and 142 yards per game rushing. Let's do some quick math. The Bengals allow 2.65 yards before contact, and Kareem Hunt averages 3.5 yards after contact. That's 6 yards per carry. Give my dude 20 touches, and we're in business. This game should be close, but I think the Browns stick to the script. This team loves to pound the rock, and I expect Kareem Hunt to be busy. I like Hunt for 100+ rushing yards, 3 or 4 catches, and a touchdown. 20 fantasy points should be no problem this week. Earlier, I said there was a ton of value at running back, and then what I do? I came out and recommended 3 of the most expensive players on the slate. But not to worry, I got 4 salary savers for you. Let's start with the Los Angeles Chargers' Justin Jackson, at home against Jacksonville, priced at $4,900, projected for 9.5 fantasy points, and I think that projection's garbage. Dude had 20 touches last week, and Jacksonville's front seven is baby soft. Arizona Cardinals' Kenyon Drake, at home against Seattle, priced at $4,800, projected for 11.3 fantasy points, and this is a glaring misprice. Dude went off for 31 fantasy points last week, and his price dropped $200. Plus, the last time we saw Seattle, they got racked by Minnesota's rushing attack. Cincinnati Bengals' Gio Bernard, at home against Cleveland, priced at $4,500, projected for 11.8 fantasy points, and with Mixon out, Gio should draw the start. And it's a nice matchup against Cleveland in their 23rd ranked rush D. And the last guy I want to mention is Green Bay Packers' Jamal Williams, on the road at Houston, priced at $4,000, projected for 7.8 fantasy points, and this play is a lock if Aaron Jones sits. But even if Jones plays, I think Williams has some standalone value. Let's turn the corner and talk Week 7 wide receivers. Receiver seems to be the position to spend up at this week, but I think there's value to be had no matter your price point. Let's start up top. Arizona Cardinals wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins. He's at home against Seattle, and Arizona's a 3-point dog. Hop's priced at $8,200 on Draftkings and projected for 19.3 fantasy points. Hopkins comes into Week 7 as wide receiver 2 in fantasy scoring. He leads the league in receptions and receiving yards. Now it's worth noting, Nuke's been battling an ankle injury for a while now, and maybe that had something to do with last week's 9-point fantasy dud. Or maybe it had to do with Kyler Murray only completing 9 passes. Either way, I expect Hopkins to get back on track this week. He's up against a Seattle defense that ranks dead last against opposing wide receivers. They allow 11.8 yards per catch and 376 yards per game receiving. The Seahawks have struggled to cover outside receivers. Over their last 2 games, they've given up 29 fantasy points to Adam Thielen and 24 fantasy points to Devontae Parker. Next man up, DeAndre Hopkins. Nuke lines up outside 94% of the time, and he's targeted on 27% of the routes he runs. Primary coverage will come from defensive back Quentin Dunbar. He allows 1.41 yards per route covered, and Pro Football Focus has that graded as a 30% advantage for Hopkins. I expect DeAndre to have a big game this week. I like Hopkins for 7+ catches, 100+ receiving yards, and his 3rd touchdown of the season. There's no doubt, I'll be stacking him with Kyler Murray this Sunday. Detroit Lions wide receiver Kenny Golladay. Detroit's at Atlanta and a 2.5-point underdog. Galladay's priced at $6,700 on DraftKings and projected for 16.7 fantasy points. We recommended this guy last week, and he came through in a major way, catching 4 passes for 105 yards. This week, he's in a prime spot against Atlanta. The Falcons' defense ranks 30th against opposing wide receivers. The secondary's been victimized on a weekly basis, and they've lined our pockets in the process. Atlanta allows 12 yards per catch, 344 yards per game receiving, and a league worst, 18 receiving touchdowns. Golladay runs routes from every spot, but 51% of his routes come from the left wide receiver position, and that means primary coverage from Kendall Sheffield. Dude gives up catches at a 71% rate. He allows 2.74 yards per route covered, and Pro Football Focus has that graded as a 67% advantage for Golladay. That's the highest on the slate. Let's call it 5+ catches, around 100 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Kenny G will be a cash game staple for me this week. Washington wide receiver Terry McLaurin. He's at home against Dallas, and Washington's a 1-point underdog. Scary Terry's priced at $5,800 and projected for 16.2 fantasy points. Hats off to this guy. He's been through 3 quarterbacks in 6 weeks. Only has 1 touchdown, and still he's putting up wide receiver 1 type numbers. Last time out against the Giants, McLaurin showed a nice rapport with quarterback Kyle Allen, commanding 12 targets, catching 7 passes for 74 yards. This week, he gets the super juicy matchup against Dallas. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. The Cowboys are bottom 5 in the NFL, allowing 12.3 yards per reception and 14 receiving touchdowns. Last week, Arizona showed what a little speed can do to the secondary. Kyler Murray hooked up with Christian Kirk on a go route, 80 yards, to the house. Now insert Scary Terry. Dude can fly. He's got 4.3 speed, and his hands, they're no joke. He'll see primary coverage from cornerback Daryl Worley. Dude's given up catches at an 83% rate, and Pro Football Focus has that graded as a 30% advantage for McLaurin. So you already know what it is. I'm down to ride with F1. I like McLaurin for 7 or 8 catches, around 100 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I think this Washington stack has legit GPP winning upside this week. If you need value plays, we got value plays. New Orleans Saints Traquan Smith at home against Carolina, priced at $4,000, projected for 12.1 fantasy points. And even though it's a bad matchup, I expect Traquan to be heavily involved. Mike Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders are out this week, so look for Breeze to hook up with Smith on the reg. Buffalo Bills Gabriel Davis on the road at the Jets, priced at $3,600, projected for 7.3 fantasy points. And with John Brown out, Davis should slide right into that starting role. His matchup against defensive back Lamar Jackson is juicy AF. Dude gives up catches at an 87% rate and allows 2.88 yards per route covered. That's the most in the league. I also like Kansas City Chiefs DeMarcus Robinson on the road at Denver, priced at $3,400, projected for 9.6 fantasy points, and he's the guy with Sammy Watkins out. Last week, he led all Kansas City pass catchers with 5 catches and 69 receiving yards. Let's keep it moving and talk tight end plays for week 7. I always try to pay down at tight end, but if you want to roster one of the big 3, Travis Kelce's got to be your guy. Earlier this week, I was locked on to Austin Hooper at 4K, but now he's out. Luckily, it's not going to cost too much more to roster Los Angeles Chargers tight end Hunter Henry. He's at home against Jacksonville, and the Chargers are a 7.5-point favorite. Hunter Henry's priced at $4,500 on Draftkings and projected for 13.4 fantasy points. The last time we saw Henry was week 5 against the Saints. He led the Chargers with 8 targets, catching 4 passes for 23 yards and a touchdown. This week, he'll see a Jacksonville defense that ranks 22nd against the position. They've given up a touchdown to an opposing tight end in each of their last 2 games, and I like that trend to continue. Henry's matchup against safety Josh Jones is super sweet. Dude gives up catches at a 93% rate, and Pro Football Focus has that graded as a 28% advantage for the Chargers' big man. Hunter Henry's a legit tight end 1 from a points per game perspective, and this week should be no different. I expect the Chargers to run on the Jags, and when Jacksonville brings down a safety, look for Henry to come up big. Let's call it 4 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown. You can lock him in. If you need a cheaper option at tight end, consider rostering Dallas Cowboys Dalton Schultz. On the road, at Washington, he's priced at $3,900, projected for 7.6 fantasy points, and I really like this play. $3,900 is the lowest price I've seen on Schultz in over a month, and Washington allows the second most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Let's round out the Week 7 preview with my top play at defense and special teams. Man fans know what the deal is. I go all in on defense, 100% exposure. And this week's lucky winner is the Washington football team defense. At home against Dallas, Washington's a 1-point underdog. DK's got him priced at $2,500, and Pro Football Focus has him projected for 6.4 fantasy points. And who would have thought 2 weeks ago? Start Washington's defense against the Cowboys, right? But that's what it is. They're top 10 in the NFL in sacks, interceptions, and yards per game allowed passing. This week, they'll see a Dallas offense that ranks 21st against opposing defenses. Last week, they looked suspect against Arizona. The Cardinals' defense had 3 sacks, 2 fumble recoveries, and 2 interceptions. Look for Washington's defense to bring the pressure early and often this week. They're converting 18% of their quarterback pressures into sacks, and that's bad news for Andy Dalton. I like Washington for 3 sacks, 2 picks, and I think they hold Dallas under 21 total points. They're a rock-solid play at $2,500. And that's a wrap on the Week 7 DraftKings Fantasy Preview. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF or on YouTube at ManFans Fantasy Football Podcast. If you love this show, smash the like button, subscribe to the podcast, and share this episode. Good luck this week. I hope you see some green screens, and I'll catch you on the flip side.